We were always traveling, a new city, a new location. Sometimes we would not stop at a place for weeks. The wagons rolled from road to road, fields to forests, small towns to quiet countryside, until one day we didn't. Life in the caravan was always moving forward. Our painted wagons rattled along dusty roads, while the horses followed paths that generations of travelers had taken before us. Some days, the world felt endless, as if every hill revealed another road and another town waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Each wagon carried something different. Some of the travelers carved small wooden figures or built tools they could trade in the markets. Others wove blankets, crafted jewelry, or sold the little things we gathered along the way when fortune happened to favor us. My mother's wagon was different. People came to her for answers. During the day, the wagon looked ordinary, just another painted caravan with bright curtains and small lanterns hanging beside the door. But in the evening, a soft glow would appear behind the canvas windows, and slowly word would spread through the town that the seer had arrived. Before long, people would begin to knock. I spent most evenings sitting quietly in the corner of the wagon, watching my mother work. The small wooden table sat in the center of the room, covered with a patterned cloth, and resting in the middle of it was the crystal ball that seemed to catch every flicker of lantern light. Visitors always stared at it the moment they sat down. To them, it looked mystical, as if something ancient might reveal itself inside the glass. To me, it was simply the crystal ball my mother had traded for a wool-knitted scarf at a small oriental shop months earlier. The owner had admired the scarf and offered the glass ball in exchange. My mother accepted with a smile, and somehow that simple trade had turned into the most convincing prop she owned. When a client sat across from her, she always began the same way. She listened. People would tell her their worries, their hopes, the strange feeling that had brought them to the wagon that evening. Sometimes they spoke for only a few minutes, but other times they talked so long the lantern burned low before they finished explaining what weighed on their mind. My mother never interrupted them. She simply watched and listened with a calm expression, occasionally nodding or asking a quiet question that encouraged them to keep talking. By the time they finished, they had usually revealed more about their lives than they had intended. Then came the performance. My mother would rest her hands beside the crystal ball and close her eyes for a moment. The room would grow quiet while the lantern light flickered against the wagon walls. And when she spoke again, her voice would be softer, almost thoughtful, as if she were translating something from far away. The truth was much simpler. One afternoon, after a client had left the wagon, smiling with relief, I finally asked the question that had been growing in my mind. How did you know what to tell him? My mother wrapped the coins he had paid in a small cloth and placed them inside the wooden box beside the table before answering. The crystal ball sat between us, catching the warm afternoon sunlight that slipped through the wagon window. She tapped the glass gently with one finger. Just showmanship. I stared at the ball, confused. Then how do you know what to say? She leaned forward slightly and tilted my chin upward so I had to look directly at her. The secret is listening. That was the first lesson she ever gave me. Most people already know the answers to their problems somewhere deep inside themselves. They simply need someone patient enough to hear them speak long enough to find it. The crystal ball slowed the moment down and made the conversation feel important, but the real work was done by paying attention. After that day, she began teaching me how to read people. She showed me how nervous hands move when someone hides the truth. She showed me how eyes shift when someone talks about love, and how voices soften when people speak about something that truly matters to them. None of it required magic, only patience and careful observation. One evening, after the last client had gone, she poured 2 small cups of tea and set them on the table between us. Outside the caravan, the rest of the travelers gathered around the fire, while someone played a fiddle beneath the open night sky. "You will learn this well one day," she told me. "Learn what?" "How to read people." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup and watched the steam drift slowly upward. "And then what?" "One day, you will sit at this table instead of me." I looked down at the crystal ball. "Tell fortunes." My mother smiled gently. "Tell people what they need to hear." She paused for a moment before adding something I did not fully understand at the time. "One day, when you have a daughter, you may teach her the same thing." At that age, the future felt far away, and I laughed at the idea. All I cared about then was the road ahead of us, the next town we might visit, and the quiet excitement of waking each morning somewhere new. But my mother only smiled, as if she already knew how the story would unfold. Outside the wagon, the fire crackled softly while the caravan shared stories beneath the stars. By morning, the horses would be harnessed again, and the painted wagons would roll back onto the road. And like always, we would follow it wherever it chose to lead. Arriving city to city was simply part of life in the caravan. We learned early how to follow the seasons instead of fighting them. When winter began creeping down from the north, we traveled south, where the air stayed warmer and the roads remained open. When summer heat grew heavy in the south, we followed cooler winds back toward the mountains and the northern towns again. Because of that rhythm, we almost never truly experienced winter. Snow belonged to other people, the ones who stayed in one place long enough for it to find them. Our wagons moved too often for storms to catch us, and most years the cold passed somewhere behind us while we were already traveling toward spring. But there was one year when winter arrived early. We had been traveling south, like always, following a narrow road that wound through long open fields and small villages scattered along the countryside. The air had already begun to cool, but no one expected the weather to change as quickly as it did. The first snow came quietly during the night. I remember waking to a silence that felt heavier than usual. When I pushed aside the small curtain beside my bed, the world outside the wagon had turned white. The horses stood calmly in the frost, their breath rising into the cold morning air, while the rest of the caravan slowly stepped outside to see what had happened. Someone laughed first, not because the snow was convenient, but because it had surprised all of us. Travel slowed after that. The road remained passable, but the wagons moved carefully, their wheels crunching through frozen ground, while the horses stepped cautiously along the narrow path. Instead of covering many miles each day, we traveled slowly and stopped earlier in the evening to give the animals time to rest. Those evenings became something special. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, someone had already started gathering wood, while others prepared the large iron pot that followed the caravan everywhere we went. Soon, a wide fire would be burning at the center of camp, its warmth reaching the wagons while sparks drifted upward into the cold night sky. Everyone gathered close. The younger travelers wrapped themselves in blankets, while the older ones sat on wooden crates or folded chairs pulled near the fire. The iron pot simmered slowly, while the smell of warm food drifted through the air, and before long, someone would pass around cups of hot cocoa to chase away the cold. For the elders, the cocoa rarely stayed cocoa for long. Someone always produced a small bottle of whiskey that made its way quietly from hand to hand, while laughter began spreading through the group. The cold air made every story feel sharper somehow, as if the winter night itself was listening along with us. Those were the nights the best stories appeared. One of the older men loved telling tales about the roads he had traveled when he was younger. He described distant deserts where the sand glowed red beneath the sunset and mountain passes where travelers could see 3 countries at once if the weather was clear. Another traveler told stories about markets so large they stretched across entire cities, filled with spices, fabrics, and music that drifted through the air like a festival that never truly ended. Even my mother sometimes shared stories on those nights. She rarely spoke about her readings or the people who visited her wagon, but she told stories about the places she had traveled long before I was born. Listening to her describe those distant roads made the world feel much larger than the small circle of fire we sat around. The snow stayed with us for nearly a week. Each morning, the wagons rolled forward again, slow but steady, while the caravan followed the road south toward warmer lands. The cold never truly bothered anyone because by evening, the fire was waiting for us again, and the circle of travelers gathered as they always had. Those nights felt different from the rest of the year. The fire seemed brighter against the dark sky, and the stories stretched longer while the wind moved gently through the trees around us. Even the horses appeared calmer, standing quietly beside the wagons, while the voices of the caravan drifted across the frozen fields. Looking back, that cold week remains one of the clearest memories of my childhood. It was the only time I remember the caravan truly moving through winter instead of around it. Yet even then the cold never felt harsh or lonely. It simply became part of the journey, something we shared together as we slowly made our way toward warmer roads. By the time the snow finally began melting beneath the wagon wheels, the air had already softened. The horses moved easier again, and each day the sun stayed a little longer in the sky. Soon the frozen ground turned back into dirt roads, and the caravan returned to its familiar rhythm. Eventually, we made it south. The caravan settled along a warm stretch of coast where the sand ran wide beside the water, and the air carried the steady sound of the sea. Our wagons formed their familiar circle near the beach, and before long, we had set up our small shops the way we always did. Tables were laid out with the things we had made along the road. Blankets were spread across the sand, and the bright colors of the wagons caught the attention of anyone walking nearby. Word spread quickly that the travelers had arrived. By the next day, people from nearby villages began wandering down to see what we were selling. Some came for the carved wooden pieces, others for the jewelry or the woven blankets that hung from the sides of the wagons. My mother's wagon drew its own quiet line of visitors as evening approached, the soft lantern light glowing through the curtains once again, while people stepped inside, hoping she might share a little wisdom about their future. But I spent most of my time by the sea. I loved the water more than any other place we traveled to. When the sun grew warm in the afternoon, I would run straight into the waves, swimming until the salt dried on my skin and the tide began rolling back toward the shore. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, and standing in the water always made the world feel much bigger than the small roads we followed from town to town. When I wasn't swimming, I searched the beach for shells. The tide always brought new ones in each morning. Some were smooth and pale. Others carried soft colors that caught the sunlight when I held them up. I filled small baskets with the best ones I could find and carried them back to the wagons, where I would sit beneath the shade, threading them carefully onto string. Soon, they became necklaces. People visiting our small market liked them, and I would hang them along a simple wooden stand beside the wagon where the sea breeze made them sway gently in the sunlight. Some travelers bought them as small gifts, while others simply admired the colors before continuing along the beach. This was always my favorite part of our journey. I'm older now. The caravan still travels the same roads, but the faces inside it have changed over the years. Some of the travelers eventually left for city lives, trading the open road for steady work and a place that stayed the same from one morning to the next. Others stayed like I did, continuing the life we had always known. For a long time, I believed I would travel that way forever. My mother eventually stepped away from her small table and the crystal ball that had once drawn so many visitors to our wagon. When she did, the place beside the lantern became mine, and before long, people were stepping into my wagon the same way they once stepped into hers. They came looking for answers. Some carried questions about love, others about work, and many simply arrived with the same restless feeling that had brought travelers to our caravan for generations. I listened the way my mother had taught me, watching the small details in their voice and expression while the lantern flickered beside the crystal ball. Most of the time, they already knew what they needed to hear, and all I really did was help them see it more clearly. Life continued that way for many years. The wagons rolled from town to town, the seasons changed around us, and the road remained the one constant thing tying it all together. I thought I understood where my life was heading, and for a long while it seemed as though the road would always be my home. Then one evening, a man stepped into my tent for a reading. We had stopped near a small town for a few days, setting up our wagons beside a quiet field where the road curved gently toward the hills. By sunset, the lantern inside my wagon was glowing as usual, and a few visitors had already come and gone while the evening air cooled outside. When he entered, I noticed something immediately. Some people walk into the wagon with hesitation, unsure what they might hear, while others arrive with a kind of excitement, curious about what the future might hold. He carried neither of those things and instead stepped inside calmly, studying the small room with quiet interest before sitting across from me at the table. From the moment I looked at him, something felt different. I had spent my entire life learning how to read people, noticing the small ways their stories revealed themselves before they even spoke. But when I met his eyes that evening, I felt something I had never quite felt before, as if our lives had already begun crossing paths long before he stepped into the wagon. I began the reading the same way I always did. My hands rested beside the crystal ball while the lantern light flickered softly across the table, and I asked him the same gentle questions that allowed people to begin speaking about themselves. But this time, I already knew the direction I wanted the conversation to go. Every word I spoke that evening was selfish. I told him about a future that held travel and unexpected turns, about meeting someone whose path would join his in ways neither of them had planned. I described a life that would change quietly but completely once that meeting happened. And somewhere inside those words, I made it clear that the person I was speaking about was me. He listened carefully, the way people often do when they sense a story beginning to unfold around them. By the time the reading finished, the lantern had burned low, and the night outside the wagon had grown quiet. When he finally stood to leave, he paused at the door. Then he asked if I would join him for coffee in town. I had spent my entire life moving from place to place, rarely stepping into the towns themselves, except to trade goods or help set up our small market. Yet something about that invitation felt natural, as though the decision had already been made somewhere long before that moment. And without thinking too long about it, I said yes. We talked for hours that night. The small cafe near the square stayed open late, and the quiet streets around us slowly emptied while we spoke about everything from travel to childhood memories. The conversation moved easily, the kind that never feels forced or hurried. And before either of us realized how much time had passed, the sky outside had already begun to lighten. I walked back toward the caravan, just as the first pale light of morning spread across the fields. The wagons were still quiet, most of the travelers still asleep after the long night before, and the air carried that peaceful silence that comes just before a new day fully begins. But my mother was awake. She stood near the fire pit, watching the horizon brighten, and the moment she saw me, she smiled the way she always did when she already understood something before anyone had spoken. We embraced without saying much at first, and when she stepped back, she studied my face for a moment before laughing softly to herself. "It won't be long now," she said. I asked what she meant, even though part of me already suspected the answer. She looked toward the road for a moment before speaking again, her voice calm in the quiet morning air. One day, your road will slow down, and when it does, you'll have a daughter who carries the same fire you do. At the time, I laughed at the idea the same way I had when she first mentioned it years earlier. The road had always been my life, and it was difficult to imagine it ending anywhere, especially when there were still so many places left to see. But life has a quiet way of turning stories in directions you never quite expect, because now, many years later, here I am, and I do have a daughter. She sits beside the lantern sometimes while I speak with visitors, watching carefully the way I once watched my mother. When the wagon grows quiet at night, I find myself teaching her the same lessons that were passed down to me about listening carefully and noticing the small things people reveal without realizing it. And sometimes, when the road grows quiet and the lantern light flickers across the crystal ball, I realize that the future never truly lived inside the glass at all. It was always waiting somewhere out on the road, appearing in the moment when two paths finally crossed and chose to continue forward together.